Before you sign something worth $200 million, you might want to read the line no one else did. The chandelier light shimmered across polished marble floors, reflecting off crystal glasses and tailored suits, the kind of room where every word was measured in millions and every silence carried weight. Michael Sterling sat at the center of it all, his cufflinks catching the light as he adjusted his sleeve with effortless precision, a man who had built an empire by never missing details and never trusting anyone else to catch them. Around him, executives leaned forward, their voices low, confident, rehearsed, while the contract lay open in front of him like a final move in a game he had already won. Clara Bennett stood a few feet away, unnoticed, a simple black uniform pressed neatly against her frame, her order pad resting quietly in her hand as if she were just another background figure in a room full of power. She had been there the entire time, refilling glasses, clearing plates, moving like silence itself, but her eyes had not missed a single word, not a single number, not a single hesitation in the voices that carried too much certainty. "Sir, you might want to check line 14. Her voice was soft, almost swallowed by the room, yet it landed with a weight that didn't belong to a waitress. No one responded at first. A few heads turned, confused, as if the room itself had rejected the interruption. Then Michael looked up, slow, deliberate, his gaze landing on her like a spotlight that had finally found its mark. There was a pause. Just a second. Then he smiled. Not kindly. "You read contracts now," he said, his tone light, almost amused, but sharp enough to cut through the air. A couple of men chuckled. Someone leaned back in their chair, shaking their head. "Or, do you just stick to menus?" The laughter came easier this time, filling the space where her words had been, pushing them aside like they didn't belong. Clara didn't move. She didn't lower her eyes. She didn't apologize. She simply stood there, her posture steady, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of her notepad, as if grounding herself in something deeper than the moment. The contract remained open. The pen rested between Michael's fingers. Across the table, one of the investors leaned forward. "We're ready when you are," he said, tapping the page lightly, his smile practiced, patient. $200 million. A signature away. Michael glanced back down, the faintest trace of irritation crossing his face, as if the interruption had been nothing more than a small inconvenience, a ripple in a perfectly controlled surface. He lifted the pen. For a brief moment, the room held its breath, the kind of silence that comes right before something irreversible. Clara looked at the clock on the wall. One tick, then another. Her eyes returned to the contract, then to him. She stepped forward. Not fast. Not hesitant. Just enough to place a small folded receipt beside the document, her hand steady as it touched the table. "Line 14, she said again, quieter this time, but somehow harder to ignore. Michael's pen hovered in the air. The laughter had faded. Something in the room shifted, subtle but real, like the moment before a storm when the air changes and no one can explain why. He glanced at the paper she had left. Just one line written in clean, precise handwriting. He read it once, then again. And for the first time that evening, Michael Sterling didn't smile. Michael Sterling did not look up immediately, but the stillness in his hand gave him away, the pen no longer moving, suspended just above the paper as if the air itself had thickened around him, and across the table the investor's confident smile began to fade, replaced by something quieter, more cautious, as Michael's eyes traced the single line Clara had written, slow at first, then sharper, more focused. The way a man reads when he realizes something does not add up, something is off. Something has been hiding in plain sight, and for the first time that evening the room did not feel controlled. It felt uncertain, like a perfectly rehearsed script that had suddenly lost its ending. He set the pen down without a word. A small sound, but in that silence it echoed. "What is this?" one of the men asked, leaning forward, trying to reclaim the rhythm of the room, but Michael did not answer him, his attention fixed entirely on the contract now, flipping one page back, then forward again, his movement sharper, faster, each second peeling away a layer of confidence that had been built over years of never being wrong.
"Clara,"
stood where she was, hands relaxed now at her sides, her gaze steady but not confrontational, as if she had already stepped out of the moment and was simply waiting for it to catch up to her. Line 14, Michael said quietly, repeating her words as if testing them against his own understanding, and when he read it again, this time in context, the shift was unmistakable, not dramatic, not loud, but real, the kind of shift that changes decisions, futures, entire companies. The investor across from him cleared his throat. It is a standard clause, he said, too quickly, too smoothly, the practiced tone now just a little too practiced. Michael did not look at him. No, he replied, his voice calm but different now, stripped of the earlier amusement. It is not. He turned the page fully, tapping the paragraph with his finger. The exact line Clara had pointed out now exposed in a way it had not been before, its language precise, almost elegant, designed to blend in, to pass unnoticed, to become dangerous only after it was too late. 6 months, Michael continued, more to himself than anyone else. Control shifts if performance targets are not met under their defined metrics. He paused. A breath. Metrics that they control. The room went quiet again, but this time it was not anticipation, it was realization, slow and uncomfortable, spreading from one face to another as the implication settled in. One of Michael's advisors leaned closer, scanning the page, then stiffened slightly, his silence saying more than any explanation could. The investor forced a small laugh, the kind that tries to restore normalcy, but only highlights how far it has slipped. It is just legal structure, he said. Nothing unusual in deals of this size. Michael finally looked up, not with anger, not with frustration, but with clarity. You are asking me to sign away control of my own company, he said, each word measured, leaving no room for interpretation, and for a moment no one responded, because there was nothing left to say that would not unravel the entire room. Then, slowly, Michael leaned back in his chair, his gaze shifting, not to the investors, not to his advisors, but to Clara, who had already stepped slightly aside, as if she never intended to be part of this moment at all, and yet had become the center of it. Where did you learn to read contracts like this? He asked, his voice quieter now, not demanding, not mocking, but searching. Clara met his eyes, calm, composed, the faintest hint of something unspoken behind them. I used to write them, she said. And just like that, the balance in the room changed completely. The words did not land loudly, but they did not need to, because the silence that followed carried more weight than anything spoken before it, and for a moment no one moved, no one laughed, no one tried to correct her, because there was something in the way Clara said it that did not invite doubt. It did not ask for validation. It simply existed as fact, and Michael Sterling felt it, not as a challenge, but as a shift, a subtle but undeniable shift in the way the room now breathed around her. One of the investors leaned back slowly, studying her with narrowed eyes, as if recalculating everything he thought he understood. You used to write contracts, he repeated, his tone careful now, no longer dismissive, but probing. Clara nodded once.
No explanation.
No defense. Just acknowledgement. Michael's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the paper, but his attention was no longer on the contract. It was on her, on the quiet certainty in her posture, on the absence of hesitation in her voice, and something in him, something that had been built on instinct and precision, recognized it immediately, not as coincidence, not as luck, but as expertise. For who, he asked. The question hung in the air, simple on the surface, but loaded beneath it, because the answer mattered, more than anyone at that table wanted to admit. Clara glanced briefly at the contract, then back at him, her expression unchanged, but her eyes carrying a depth that had not been visible before. For firms like yours, she said, and this time there was the faintest pause, just enough to let the words settle, just enough to let the implication unfold without force. One of Michael's advisors shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable now, his earlier confidence replaced by a quiet tension that spread through the group like a slow current. If that is true, the advisor said, clearing his throat, trying to regain control of the conversation, then why are you here? It was not an insult, not exactly, but it carried the same question everyone in the room was now thinking. How someone who spoke like that, who saw what others missed, could be standing in a uniform, holding an order pad instead of a portfolio. Clara did not answer immediately. She reached for the empty glass on the table, refilled it with steady hands, the simple act grounding the moment back into something ordinary, something familiar, before she spoke again. "Because life does not always follow the plan you write," she said quietly, and there was no bitterness in it, no regret. Just truth, simple and unpolished. Michael watched her carefully, not interrupting, not questioning, because for the first time he understood that whatever story stood behind those words was not one she offered lightly, and not one that needed to be explained to be real. Across the table, the investor straightened his jacket, his composure returning in fragments, but not fully, never fully, because the balance had already shifted too far. "Regardless," he said, forcing a professional tone, "we can revise the clause if necessary." Michael did not look at him. "No," he said, calm, final. "There will be no revisions tonight." The words landed with certainty, and the meaning behind them was clear. The deal was no longer moving forward. Not like this, not under these terms, not after what had just been revealed. A contract worth $200 million, paused by a single line written on the back of a receipt. Michael slowly closed the folder, the soft sound of paper meeting paper echoing in the quiet room, and when he looked up again, his gaze returned to Clara. But this time there was no trace of amusement, no hint of dismissal, only recognition, sharp and undeniable. "You just saved me from making the most expensive mistake of my career," he said, his voice low, almost reflective, and Clara met his eyes for a brief moment before stepping back, returning to the space she had always occupied, just outside the center, just beyond the spotlight. "I just read what was already there," she replied. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood something they had missed before, not about the contract, not about the deal, but about her, because she had never needed to raise her voice to change the outcome. She had only needed to see what others chose to ignore. No one reached for their glass anymore. No one checked their phone. No one tried to redirect the conversation, because something more important than the deal had taken hold of the room, something quieter but far more powerful, the kind of presence that does not demand attention but reshapes it completely, and Michael Sterling felt it most of all, sitting there with a closed contract in front of him, and a realization that did not come from numbers or strategy, but from a single moment he could not undo. He glanced at the chair across from him, then back at Clara, who had already turned slightly, as if ready to return to her shift, to disappear back into the rhythm of plates and orders and passing conversations that had nothing to do with $200 million or hidden clauses. "Wait," he said, not loudly but enough to stop her, and this time the word carried no authority, no command, only intention. Clara paused. Slowly, she turned back. Her expression was neutral, composed, but there was a quiet boundary in her eyes now, something that had not been there before, something that came after being underestimated and then seen. Michael stood up, the movement deliberate, and for a brief second the room seemed to shift again, not because he stood but because of why he did. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the empty chair beside the table, the one no one had offered her before. A few of the executives exchanged glances, uncertain, uncomfortable, as if the rules of the room had been rewritten without warning. Clara looked at the chair, then at him. She did not move immediately. "I am working," she said, her voice calm, not defensive, not dismissive, just factual. Michael nodded once, accepting it, not pushing further. "Then give me 5 minutes," he replied, softer now, almost careful, "not as your customer, but as someone who owes you an answer." That word lingered. Owes. It did not belong easily to a man like him, and yet he did not take it back. Clara studied him for a moment, as if weighing something invisible, then slowly she stepped closer, not sitting, but standing at the edge of the table, close enough to be part of the conversation, far enough to remain separate from it. Michael glanced briefly at the others, then back at her, his focus narrowing, the noise of the room fading into the background. "I laughed at you," he said, direct, without decoration, without excuse, in front of everyone. No one interrupted. No one dared to soften it, because it did not need softening. It needed acknowledgement. Clara did not react. She simply listened. Michael continued, his voice steady, but quieter than before, as if each word had to pass through something deeper now. And I almost signed that contract because I assumed I already knew everything I needed to know. He paused. A breath. I was wrong. The words settled into the space between them, simple, but heavy, not because they were difficult to say, but because they were rare. Clara's gaze did not change, but something in the air did, something subtle, like tension releasing without noise. You were confident, she said, not correcting him, not challenging him, just naming it for what it was. Michael gave a small, almost ironic smile. There is a difference, he replied, between confidence and blindness. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and in that silence the entire room seemed to understand that what had just happened was no longer about a contract, or a deal, or even a mistake. It was about perspective, about the thin line between power and perception, and how easily one could fail without ever realizing it. Michael reached into his jacket, pulling out a business card, placing it on the table between them, not sliding it forward, not offering it with expectation, just setting it there. If you ever decide you are done serving tables, he said, his tone even, respectful, I would like to offer you a place where your voice is heard before the deal is signed, not after. Clara glanced at the card, then back at him, and for the first time there was the faintest shift in her expression. Not surprise, not pride, but something quieter, something that did not need validation. She picked up the card, looked at it, then folded it once, carefully, before slipping it into her apron. I do not need a place to be heard, she said gently, meeting his eyes one last time. I just need people willing to listen. And with that, she turned, stepping away from the table, leaving behind a room full of people who had just witnessed something they could not measure, but would not forget. The sound of conversation slowly returned, but it did not feel the same, not as sharp, not as confident, as if something invisible had shifted the weight of every word in the room, and Michael Sterling remained standing for a moment longer, watching the space where Clara had been, the echo of her presence lingering in a way he could not ignore, because it was not what she said that stayed with him. It was how little she needed to say to change everything. He sat down again, slower this time, his hand resting on the closed contract as if it no longer belonged to him, and across the table his advisors exchanged quiet looks, waiting, unsure whether to speak or remain silent, because the man they were used to seeing, decisive, unshaken, already 3 steps ahead, was now thinking in a way they had not seen before, not faster, not sharper, but deeper. We should renegotiate, one of them finally said, carefully, trying to rebuild the moment into something familiar, something controllable. Michael shook his head slightly. No, he replied, his voice calm, final. We walk away. The words landed without hesitation, and this time no one argued, because they understood that this was not a negotiation anymore. It was a lesson already learned. The investors gathered their papers, their composure restored only on the surface, their confidence thinner now, stretched over something they could not fully recover from, and within minutes the table that had once held a $200 million deal was just a table again, covered with untouched glasses and the quiet remains of a conversation that had ended without conclusion. Michael did not leave immediately. He sat there, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of the folder, not impatient, not distracted, but reflective, replaying the moment in his mind, the laughter, the assumption, the certainty that had come so easily to him, and how quickly it had been dismantled by someone he had not even considered worth listening to. Across the room, Clara moved between tables with the same steady rhythm as before, carrying plates, refilling drinks, responding to small requests that had nothing to do with contracts or control, and yet now every movement seemed different to him, not because she had changed, but because he had. He noticed the way she paused when someone spoke, the way she listened fully before responding, the way her attention never rushed ahead of the moment, and he realized something uncomfortable, something precise, that while he had built his success on anticipating outcomes, she had built hers on understanding what was already present. He stood up again, this time without urgency, and walked across the room, not as a man making an entrance, but as someone approaching a conversation he had not finished. Clara was placing a check on a nearby table when she noticed him, her expression unchanged, professional, but aware. "Is there anything else you need, sir?" she asked, the same words she had likely said 100 times that night, but this time they carried a different meaning. Michael paused for a second, just enough to choose his words carefully. "Yes," he said, "a recommendation." She tilted her head slightly, waiting. "If you were in my position," he continued, "what would you do next?" It was not a test. It was not a challenge. It was a question, real and unguarded. Clara glanced at the table he had left, at the closed contract, then back at him. "I would read everything twice," she said, "and listen once more than I speak." Michael gave a small nod, absorbing it, not questioning it, not debating it, because he understood now that her answers did not come from theory, they came from experience, from something earned quietly over time. "That is all?" he asked. Clara allowed the faintest hint of a smile, barely there, but enough. "That is usually enough," she replied. And for the first time that evening, Michael did not look for more because he knew that sometimes the simplest truth was the one most often ignored, and the most valuable lesson was not the one that cost millions, but the one that prevented them from being lost in the first place. The rhythm of the restaurant continued, steady and unremarkable, plates moving, voices blending, the quiet hum of ordinary life filling the space, where something extraordinary had just taken place, and yet for Michael Sterling nothing felt ordinary anymore, not the lighting, not the conversations, not even the weight of his own thoughts, because once a blind spot is revealed, it does not disappear, it stays, reshaping the way you see everything that follows. He remained near the table for a moment longer, watching Clara as she moved through her shift with the same calm precision, never rushing, never lingering, as if the moment they had just shared had already been filed away in a place she did not need to revisit. That was what unsettled him most. Not that she had corrected him, but that she had not needed recognition for it, that she had returned to her work without waiting for acknowledgement, without expecting anything in return. It was a kind of confidence he was not used to, one that did not announce itself. Michael walked back to his table slowly, picking up the receipt she had written on earlier, the small piece of paper now carrying more weight than the contract itself, and he studied the handwriting again. Precise, deliberate, the kind that came from someone who understood that details mattered long before anyone else noticed them. He folded the receipt carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket, not as a souvenir, but as a reminder, something he would not allow himself to forget. Across the room, one of his senior advisors approached him, lowering his voice as he spoke. "We have another offer waiting," he said. "A cleaner deal, less risk." Michael listened, but his attention drifted, not because the deal was unimportant, but because the way he measured importance had shifted, and for the first time in years he was not thinking about speed, or advantage, or leverage, he was thinking about clarity. "We will review it tomorrow," Michael replied, his tone steady, but different, less urgent, more intentional. The advisor nodded, surprised but not questioning, sensing that something in his decision-making had changed, even if he could not yet define how. Michael glanced at his watch, then back at the room, and without fully realizing it, his eyes found Clara again, not because he was searching, but because his perspective had recalibrated, and now he noticed what he had once ignored. A couple at one table asked her a question, something simple about the menu, and she listened fully before answering, her response clear, concise, without excess, and Michael recognized the same pattern, the same discipline, the same respect for information that had saved him moments earlier, just applied in a different setting. It was not about contracts. It was about how she approached everything. He exhaled slowly, a quiet release, as if something inside him had settled into place, not perfectly, but honestly. And he understood then that the most valuable part of the night was not the deal he had avoided, but the perspective he had gained, the realization that expertise does not always arrive in a tailored suit, and that insight does not need a title to be real. As he prepared to leave, he placed a generous tip on the table, but hesitated for a brief second, not because of the amount, but because he knew it could not represent what had actually been given to him, and he adjusted it slightly, not higher, not lower, but intentional, as if trying to match meaning with gesture, even though he knew it never fully could. He walked toward the exit, each step measured, the noise of the restaurant fading behind him, and just before he reached the door, he paused, glancing back one last time, not the table, not at the empty chairs, but at Clara, who had already moved on to the next customer, the next moment, the next quiet interaction that would likely go unnoticed by everyone else. Michael nodded once, not expecting her to see it, not needing her to, and then he stepped outside into the cool night air, carrying with him something he had not planned to gain, something that could not be negotiated or acquired, only recognized when it appeared. And for the first time in a long time, he did not feel ahead of the moment. He felt present inside it. The night air carried a quiet chill, the kind that sharpened thought rather than distracted it, and Michael Sterling stood beside his car for a moment longer than usual, his hand resting on the door handle but not opening it, because something inside him resisted the instinct to move on too quickly, to return to the familiar rhythm of decisions and deadlines without fully absorbing what had just happened. The city moved around him, headlights passing, distant conversations fading into the background, but his focus remained anchored to a single realization that refused to loosen its hold. He had almost made a mistake he would not have seen until it was too late, and the person who stopped him was someone he had dismissed in less than a second. He exhaled slowly, then reached into his jacket, pulling out the folded receipt again, the paper now slightly creased from where he had placed it earlier, and he looked at the line one more time, not because he needed to verify it, but because he needed to remember how easily it could have been overlooked. After a moment, he slid into the car, the interior quiet and controlled, a space designed for efficiency, for focus, for decisions made without interruption, but tonight it felt different, less like a command center and more like a place for reflection. "Office?" the driver asked from the front seat, his voice neutral. Michael paused. In the past, the answer would have come instantly. Tonight, it did not. "No," he said finally, his tone measured. "Home." The driver nodded, pulling into the flow of traffic, and as the city lights passed by, Michael leaned back slightly, his eyes tracing the movement without really seeing it, because his mind was already moving elsewhere, replaying the moment again, not the mistake, but the correction, not the laughter, but the silence that followed it, and the calm voice that had cut through everything without raising itself above the room. Back at the restaurant, Clara Bennett finished clearing a table, stacking plates with practiced efficiency before carrying them toward the kitchen, the routine unchanged, the pace steady, as if nothing about the night had been unusual, and in many ways, for her, it was not, because she had learned long ago that moments like that did not define her, they simply revealed what was already there. As she stepped into the back hallway, the noise of the dining room softened, replaced by the quieter sounds of preparation and movement behind the scenes, and she allowed herself a brief pause, just a second, her hand resting lightly against the counter as she exhaled, not out of stress, but out of release, the kind that comes after holding steady through something that could have easily gone differently. She reached into her apron, feeling the edge of the folded business card Michael had given her, her fingers brushing against it before she pulled it out, looking at the name printed cleanly across the surface, the title, the contact number, all the symbols of a world she had once known well, a world she had stepped away from not because she could not stay, but because staying had cost more than leaving. She studied the card for a moment, then flipped it over, her expression unreadable, before sliding it back into her apron without comment, without decision, because not everything needed to be decided immediately. In the dining room, new guests were being seated, new conversations beginning, the cycle continuing as it always did, and Clara stepped back into it without hesitation, her posture the same, her pace the same, her presence once again blending into the background of a room that would likely never understand the full weight of what had just passed through it. And somewhere across the city, Michael Sterling sat in silence, holding on to a lesson he had not planned to learn, one that would follow him into every meeting, every decision, every moment where assumption threatened to replace attention, because now he knew something he had not known before, something simple, something precise, that the most dangerous mistake is not the one you make, but the one you are too certain to question. Morning arrived without announcement, Just a slow shift of light across glass buildings and quiet streets, and Michael Sterling was already awake before the city fully caught up, sitting at his desk with a fresh contract open in front of him, untouched, unread, because for the first time in years he did not begin by scanning for advantage. He began by questioning what he might be missing. The receipt from the night before lay beside the document, unfolded now, its single line still as precise as it had been when it stopped him, and he let his eyes rest on it for a moment before turning to the contract again, reading slowly, deliberately, not skimming, not assuming, his attention anchored to every detail as if each line deserved to be seen before it could be judged. Across the office, his assistant paused at the door, surprised to see him reading in silence rather than dictating instructions or moving quickly through decisions, but she said nothing, sensing that something had changed in a way that did not need explanation. Meanwhile, back at the restaurant, Clara Bennett tied the strings of her apron behind her back, her movements calm and practiced, the routine familiar, grounding, as if the previous night had simply folded into the rhythm of everything else she had already lived through. The morning crowd was lighter, quieter, a different kind of energy, one that allowed space between conversations, and she moved through it with the same steady presence, greeting customers, taking orders, listening more than she spoke, her attention always anchored in the moment in front of her. A regular at the counter asked about the daily special, and she explained it simply. Clearly, the same precision she had used with the contract now applied to something as ordinary as breakfast, because to her there was no real difference. Only the context changed, not the care. Hours passed, decisions were made, coffee cups were emptied and refilled, and somewhere in between, the world continued exactly as it always had, unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place inside two people moving through entirely different lives. Around noon, the restaurant door opened again, and a subtle change in the room followed, not because anyone recognized the man who walked in, but because of the way he carried himself now, not as someone entering to be served, but as someone returning with intention. Michael stepped inside, his gaze moving briefly across the room before settling on Clara, who was already moving toward another table, unaware for a moment that he had returned. He did not interrupt her. He did not call out. He simply waited, standing near the entrance, his hands relaxed at his sides, his presence quieter than it had been the night before, as if he had left something behind and was not in a hurry to pick it up again. When Clara finally turned and noticed him, there was no surprise in her expression, only recognition, the kind that does not ask questions, it simply acknowledges what is. She approached, her posture the same, her voice steady. "Table for one?" she asked, as if nothing had changed, as if he were just another guest. Michael gave a small nod. "If you are working," he said, "then yes." She gestured toward a table near the window, simple, unremarkable, the kind of place where conversations were not meant to be overheard, and as he sat down, he placed the folded receipt on the table between them, not as evidence, not as leverage, but as a reminder of a moment that had reshaped something he could not ignore. "I read everything twice this morning," he said, his tone even, almost reflective, "and for the first time, I realized how much I usually skip." Clara glanced at the receipt, then back at him, her expression unchanged, but attentive. "Most people do," she replied quietly. Michael leaned back slightly, his gaze steady, not challenging, not testing. "I do not want to be most people," he said. Clara allowed a brief pause, just long enough to let the words settle before she responded. "Then you already started changing," she said, and there was no praise in it, no approval, just a simple acknowledgement of direction. Outside, the city moved forward without hesitation, unaware of the quiet conversation taking place inside a small restaurant, a conversation that carried no contracts, no numbers, no negotiations, only clarity, slowly forming, one sentence at a time. Clara placed a glass of water on the table, the movement simple, unhurried, as if nothing about the moment required urgency, and Michael Sterling watched it with a kind of attention that would have surprised anyone who knew him, because he was not studying her for advantage, not analyzing her for leverage. He was simply observing, something he had rarely allowed himself to do without turning it into strategy. The morning light filtered through the window beside them, soft, steady, illuminating the small details that usually went unnoticed: the edge of the table, the faint crease in the receipt, the quiet steadiness in Clara's posture, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the silence no longer needed to be filled. "What will you order?" she asked finally, her voice neutral, returning the moment to something ordinary, something grounded. Michael glanced at the menu, then back at her, and for the first time, he actually read it, not scanning, not assuming, just reading, the way she had suggested without ever instructing him directly. "What do you recommend?" he asked. Clara considered for a brief second. "The simplest thing on the menu," she said. "Done well." He gave a small nod, understanding more than the words themselves. "I will take that," he replied. She wrote it down, her handwriting as precise as it had been on the receipt, then stepped away without lingering, without turning the moment into something more than it was, because she did not need to. Michael sat back, his gaze drifting briefly to the receipt again, then out the window, where the city continued moving at its usual pace, fast, relentless, always forward, and yet something inside him had slowed, not in hesitation, but in awareness, the kind that does not rush to conclusions because it no longer assumes it already knows them. Around him, other customers spoke in quiet tones, forks met plates, coffee cups were lifted and set down, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing without pause, and he realized something simple, something he had overlooked for years, that clarity does not come from speed, it comes from attention, and attention requires something he had often traded away: patience. When Clara returned with his order, she set the plate down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table without thinking, the same quiet precision she applied to everything, and Michael noticed it, not because it was extraordinary but because it was consistent. "Thank you," he said, and this time the words were not automatic, they were intentional. Clara gave a small nod, nothing more, before turning to continue her work, moving seamlessly back into the flow of the room, her presence once again blending into the background, not diminished, but grounded in something that did not depend on recognition. Michael took a bite, simple, balanced, exactly as described, and he allowed himself to sit with it, not rushing, not reaching for his phone, not thinking 3 steps ahead, just present in the moment, and for the first time in a long time, that felt unfamiliar but not uncomfortable. He finished his meal slowly, placing the fork down with the same care he had seen in her movements, and when the check arrived, he looked at it, really looked at it, before reaching for his wallet, not because he doubted it, but because he had learned that even the smallest details deserved attention. He left the payment, along with the receipt from the night before, unfolded now, placed neatly beside it, not as a message, not as a gesture meant to be interpreted, but as a quiet acknowledgement of something shared. As he stood to leave, he paused for a brief second, his gaze finding Clara once more across the room, and though she did not look up, did not react, it did not matter, because the moment was no longer about being seen, it was about understanding. Michael stepped outside again, the daylight clearer now, the city louder, faster, unchanged, and yet he carried something different with him, something that would not fade with distance or time, because it had already settled into the way he would move forward. And somewhere behind him, inside a small restaurant that would continue as it always had, Clara Bennett served another table, listened to another voice, and reminded the world, without ever saying it out loud, that the quiet ones are never truly ordinary.